In the spring of 1851, probate clocks in Natchez, Mississippi opened a will so shocking that 3 of them refused to process it. The document had been sealed by the testator's own hand with instructions that it remain unopened for 7 days after her death. When those 7 days passed and the seal was finally broken, the words inside would trigger the longest, most bitter inheritance battle in Mississippi history. The will belonged to Lenora Ashford Beaumont, widow of tobacco magnate Charles Beaumont, who had died leaving her one of the wealthiest women in the state. Her estate included Blackwater Plantation, spanning 2,000 acres of prime Mississippi Delta land, a townhouse in Natchez worth a fortune, controlling shares in 2 riverboat companies, and investments that generated income most men would envy. Lenora had 3 daughters, all unmarried, all living under her roof, all expecting to inherit the empire their father had built and their mother had doubled in value over 15 years of widowhood. Instead, the entire estate, every acre, every dollar, every share of stock, went to a single man. A man who couldn't read the document that made him wealthy. A man who'd spent 32 years as property. A man whose name appeared in Lenora's ledgers under a very specific category: field labor, maximum strength, purchased 1819. His name was Samuel. And the reading of Lenora Beaumont's will would expose a relationship so scandalous, so impossible within the rules of Southern society, that Natchez would spend the next decade trying to bury the truth of what actually happened at Blackwater Plantation. The probate records contain over 800 pages of testimony, court transcripts, personal letters, witness statements, medical documents. Together, they tell a story that history books preferred to forget. A story about power, about survival, about a choice that destroyed one family to acknowledge another. About a woman who violated every rule her society held sacred, and the man who paid the price for her decision. Before we go deeper into Lenora Beaumont's impossible will and the secrets that died with her, make sure you're subscribed to the Sealed Room. We bring you the stories that got buried in America's past, the ones that expose uncomfortable truths about who we were and what we built our world on. Hit that notification bell, because stories like this don't stay buried by accident, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We want to know who's discovering these dark corners of history with us. What makes the Beaumont case so disturbing isn't just what the will said, but what it forced into public record about the hidden architecture of plantation life. About what happened in the spaces where legal authority and human desire collided. About the relationships that everyone knew existed, but no one could acknowledge without threatening the entire social order. Natchez, in 1851, represented the pinnacle of cotton wealth. The city sat high on the Mississippi River bluffs, its mansions overlooking the muddy water that carried fortunes to New Orleans and the world beyond. While Charleston had older money and more refined pretensions, Natchez had raw wealth, newer fortunes, and fewer questions about how those fortunes were made. The Beaumont fortune had started with tobacco in Virginia. Charles Beaumont had moved to Mississippi in 1815 with his young wife Lenora, 30 enslaved people, and capital enough to purchase river bottom land when it was still cheap. He planted tobacco initially, then shifted to cotton as prices soared. He died in 1836 of yellow fever, leaving Lenora a 34-year-old widow with 3 daughters under the age of 10 and an estate that most men would have struggled to manage. Mississippi law in 1836 gave widows extraordinary property rights compared to married women. A married woman's property belonged to her husband, but a widow controlled her inheritance absolutely. She could buy, sell, invest, and manage without male oversight. She could make contracts. She could sue and be sued. She had legal personhood that marriage would have stripped away. Lenora never remarried. And over the next 15 years, she transformed her inheritance into something that dwarfed what Charles had left her. She expanded Blackwater Plantation from 800 acres to 2,000, purchasing adjacent properties when owners failed or died. She shifted production from tobacco to cotton entirely, timing the market perfectly. She invested in riverboat companies when steam was replacing sail, making fortunes on cargo transport. She bought timber rights in the interior and sold lumber to the endless construction boom. She purchased rental properties in Natchez that generated steady income. By 1851, she was worth what would be millions today, and she'd done it all without a husband, without a male business partner, without giving any man control over her decisions. Natchez society didn't quite know what to make of her. Women of her class were supposed to be ornamental, delicate, concerned with social graces rather than profit margins. Lenora attended church. She hosted dinners. She observed the proprieties. But she also attended cotton exchange meetings, negotiated contracts herself, and fired overseers who didn't meet her production standards. She wore black for Charles for the required period, then shifted to dark colors that suggested mourning without requiring it. She was 50 years old in 1851, tall, austere, with gray hair she didn't bother to dye, and a face that suggested someone who'd stopped caring what others thought of her appearance. Her daughters had absorbed their mother's independence to varying degrees. Margaret, the eldest at 26, most resembled Lenora in temperament. Sharp-minded, impatient with social rituals, more interested in the plantation's account books than in needlework. She'd refused 3 marriage proposals, much to Natchez society's dismay. A woman of her wealth and family should have been married by 20. Caroline, 23, occupied the middle ground. She enjoyed social occasions but also had a head for figures. She managed the household staff at the Natchez townhouse with efficiency that bordered on severity. The youngest, Virginia, 21, was beautiful in a way her sisters weren't. Delicate features, golden hair, the kind of looks that made men forget she came with a formidable mother and sharp-tongued sisters. She'd had proposals too, but Lenora had rejected all of them as fortune hunters interested in Beaumont money rather than her daughter. The 3 sisters lived with their mother in the Natchez townhouse during the social season and at Blackwater Plantation the rest of the year. They existed in a strange state of privilege and constraint. Wealthy beyond most people's imagination, but unmarried and therefore subject to their mother's authority. Educated, capable, but living in a world that gave them no legal independence while their mother lived. Everything they had, everything they expected to inherit, depended on Lenora's decisions and Lenora's will. What they didn't know, what Natchez society didn't know, was that Lenora's most important relationship wasn't with her daughters, her business associates, or her social circle. It was with a man who'd come to Blackwater Plantation as property in 1819 and had somehow, impossibly, become the center of her world. Samuel was 45 years old in 1851. He'd been born in Virginia, sold south when he was 13, sold again at 17. Lenora's husband Charles had purchased him in New Orleans specifically for his size and strength. 6 feet 4 inches tall, powerfully built, capable of work that would break smaller men. In the brutal economics of plantation slavery, Samuel represented premium labor, the kind of worker who could be driven hard during planting and harvest season. He'd worked the tobacco fields first, then cotton. He'd survived the fevers that killed other workers. He'd endured the violence that was standard practice. He'd watched people he knew sold away, families separated, children torn from mothers. He'd learned to show nothing, to keep his thoughts buried where overseers couldn't reach them, to be exactly what white authority demanded, strong, obedient, and seemingly without interior life. But Samuel could think, and Samuel could observe. And Samuel, unlike most field laborers, had caught the attention of someone who mattered. The exact beginning of Lenora and Samuel's relationship is impossible to pinpoint from the historical record. What survives are fragments, testimony from people who saw pieces of something they didn't fully understand, letters that hint at more than they state directly, and legal documents that expose what everyone tried to keep hidden. What we know. After Charles Beaumont's death in 1836, Lenora began making changes to how Blackwater operated. She fired the overseer Charles had employed, a man known for vicious discipline. She implemented what she called task labor rather than gang labor, meaning workers who completed their assigned tasks could finish their day rather than working sunup to sundown regardless. She reduced physical punishment, though she didn't eliminate it. These weren't acts of kindness, exactly. Lenora saw them as efficiency measures. Healthier workers produced more. Fear motivated less effectively than the possibility of small mercies. But she also began pulling Samuel from field labor for special assignments. Managing other workers. Overseeing repairs to buildings. Handling livestock. Tasks that required judgment rather than just strength. By 1840, Samuel was functioning as an informal plantation manager, though he had no official title, and Lenora hired white overseers to maintain appearances. People noticed. It was impossible not to notice when an enslaved man had authority that overseers resented. When he spoke directly to the plantation mistress, rather than through intermediaries. When he appeared at the main house regularly for consultations about plantation business. The speculation started quietly. Whispers among household staff. Knowing looks between overseers. Rumors in Natchez that Lenora Beaumont had unusual arrangements at Blackwater. But nothing was ever said directly, because saying it directly would require acknowledging something that society insisted was impossible. A white woman of Lenora's class could not have a relationship with an enslaved man. The racial hierarchy forbade it. The gender expectations made it unthinkable. White men's relationships with enslaved women were tacitly accepted, hidden beneath lies about property rights and access. But the reverse threatened the entire structure. White women were supposed to be protected, pure, above the contamination of such contact. The idea that a white woman might choose such a relationship, might desire it, might prefer an enslaved man to the white suitors available to her, was so transgressive that even thinking it felt dangerous. So people didn't think it. They noticed Samuel's unusual position. They remarked on Lenora's continued widowhood. They wondered why such a wealthy woman never remarried. But they stopped short of making the connection, because making that connection would require admitting that the social order they depended on was more fragile than they wanted to believe. Lenora's daughters existed in their own state of denial. They saw Samuel daily. They knew he had authority unusual for his position. Margaret, the sharp one, sometimes consulted him about plantation business when Lenora was unavailable. Caroline gave him instructions about household matters that required coordination with field work. Virginia barely acknowledged his existence, as she barely acknowledged most of the enslaved people around her. Did they know? Did they suspect? The testimony that would later emerge in court suggests they saw what they wanted to see and refused to look deeper. It was safer that way. Easier to believe the mother was simply an eccentric widow who ran her plantation unconventionally than to confront the possibility that something else entirely was happening. The spring of 1851 brought changes to Blackwater that should have signaled something was wrong. Lenora, always healthy, always formidable, began to show signs of illness. She lost weight. She tired easily. She spent more time at Blackwater and less in Natchez, claiming the social season exhausted her. By March, she'd stopped attending church, and for a woman of her religious observance, that absence screamed significance. Her daughters noticed but attributed it to age. Their mother was 50. Women of 50 often declined. They urged her to see doctors. She refused, saying she knew her own body and wouldn't be prodded by physicians who knew less than she did about what ailed her. What Lenora didn't tell her daughters was that she'd consulted a doctor privately. Dr. Harrison Webb, a Natchez physician she'd known for years, had examined her in February and delivered a diagnosis that changed everything. Ovarian tumor, advanced and inoperable. She had months, perhaps weeks. The pain would worsen. The decline would be visible. There was nothing medicine could do except manage her comfort at the end. Lenora took the news with the same cold practicality she'd applied to business decisions. She had limited time. She had arrangements to make. And she had a choice to make about what would happen to everything she'd built. In early April 1851, Lenora summoned her attorney to Blackwater Plantation. Jonathan Mercer had handled the Beaumont legal affairs since Charles S. death. He was 60 years old, cautious, respectable, and utterly unprepared for what Lenora was about to ask him to do. She received him in her study, a room her daughters rarely entered. Account books lined the shelves. Maps of the plantation covered one wall. The desk was mahogany, massive, covered with correspondence and financial documents. This was where Lenora conducted business, and the room reflected her mind, ordered, efficient, unsentimental or focused on results. Mercer noticed immediately how much weight she'd lost. Her dress hung loosely. Her face had taken on the gray pallor that suggested serious illness. But her eyes remained sharp, and when she spoke, her voice carried its usual authority. "I need a new will, Jonathan. I need it drafted today, and I need it executed before the week is out." Mercer set down his case and pulled out paper and pen. "Of course. I assume you wish to update the provisions for your daughters? Perhaps divide the estate more specifically now that they are older." "No. I'm removing my daughters from the will entirely except for the minimum the law requires." The pen stopped moving. Mercer looked up, certain he'd misheard. "Lenora, surely you don't mean—" "I mean exactly what I said. Margaret, Caroline, and Virginia will each receive $5,000. Not a penny more. The remainder of my estate goes elsewhere." Mercer's legal training took over. He began calculating quickly. $5,000 each was substantial for most people, but it was nothing compared to the Beaumont fortune. The plantation alone was worth over $200,000. The business interests, the properties, the investments could all be valued at similar amounts. Lenora was proposing to give her daughters perhaps 3% of her total estate. "Who receives the remainder?" he asked carefully. Lenora's pause was brief, but Mercer would remember it for the rest of his life. It was the pause of someone stepping off a cliff and knowing exactly what the fall would cost. "Samuel. Enslaved to me, currently serving as plantation manager, though he holds no legal title. I'm granting him immediate freedom upon my death and transferring to him the entirety of Blackwater Plantation, all my business interests, all properties, all investments, and all liquid assets not specifically bequeathed to my daughters." The silence that followed was so complete that Mercer could hear his own heartbeat. He put down his pen deliberately, folded his hands, and tried to find words that wouldn't offend his most important client, while still conveying the absolute impossibility of what she'd just proposed. "Lenora, I've served your family for 16 years. I have great respect for your judgment. But what you're proposing is legally, socially, and practically impossible. Mississippi law restricts what can be left to enslaved people. Your daughters have legal claims as heirs. The community will never accept this. Beyond the legal obstacles, you'd be destroying your daughters' futures and your own reputation." "My reputation will be dead along with me," Lenora said flatly. "As for my daughters, $5,000 each is more than most women in Mississippi can expect. They are educated. They are capable. They can make their own ways. They'll contest the will immediately. Any court in Mississippi will side with them. Then structure it in a way that survives challenge. You're an attorney, Jonathan. You know there are mechanisms, trusts, delayed transfers, legal instruments that accomplish what direct bequests cannot. I've spent 3 months studying Mississippi property law, manumission restrictions, and inheritance cases. I know what I'm asking is difficult. I'm not asking if it's impossible." Mercer realized he was dealing with the same woman who doubled her fortune through careful legal navigation and iron will. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why would you do this to your own daughters?" Lenora stood and walked to the window overlooking the plantation. In the distance, workers moved through the cotton fields. The spring planting was underway, the earth churned and ready for seed that would grow into wealth for whoever owned the harvest. "Because Samuel has been the true partner in building this estate for 15 years, she said quietly. "Because he's made every decision with me, solved every problem, expanded every business venture. Because he has more right to what we built together than daughters who've contributed nothing but expectation and entitlement. Lenora, he's an enslaved man. The law sees him as property. Whatever partnership you believe existed, it cannot be legally recognized." She turned back to face him, and her expression carried something Mercer couldn't quite name. Defiance, certainly, but also something deeper. Something that looked like the relief of finally telling truth after years of lies. "The law is wrong, Jonathan. And I'm dying. I don't have time to pretend anymore that the law reflects reality. Samuel and I have been together for 14 years. Not as master and slave. As partners. As equals in everything except legal status. He knows more about running this plantation than any overseer I could hire. He understands cotton markets, riverboat schedules, timber values, and labor management. He's brilliant, and the only reason Natchez doesn't know it is because admitting it would threaten their comfortable assumptions about who can think and who can only work. If this becomes public, if you acknowledge this relationship openly, you'll destroy any chance of the will standing. The court will declare you mentally incompetent. They'll say you were under undue influence. They'll appoint a guardian for your affairs and invalidate everything you're trying to do. Then we don't make it public until after I'm dead. We draft the will. We keep it sealed. We arrange for it to be read only after I'm buried. By the time anyone knows what I've done, I'll be beyond their judgment." Mercer spent the next 2 hours trying to dissuade her. He presented every legal argument, every practical obstacle, every social consequence. Lenora counted each point with the precision of someone who'd spent months preparing for this exact conversation. She'd studied case law. She'd identified precedents where unusual bequests had survived challenge. She'd found examples of enslaved people being freed through wills and granted property through trust arrangements. Finally, Mercer surrendered to the inevitable. "I'll draft it. But I want it on record that I advised against this in the strongest possible terms." "Noted and accepted," Lenora said. "Now write exactly what I tell you." They worked until well past dark. The will Mercer produced was a masterpiece of legal architecture designed to survive the assault he knew would come. It granted Samuel immediate manumission upon Lenora's death, using language carefully crafted to comply with Mississippi's restrictive freedom laws. It established a trust that would hold the plantation in business interest with Samuel as the sole trustee and beneficiary, a structure that technically didn't transfer property to a person of color, but gave him complete control. It included provisions for Samuel to purchase additional enslaved people at Blackwater who wished to be freed, allowing him to gradually manumit everyone on the plantation using estate funds. Most controversially, it included a section Lenora insisted be written word for word as she dictated. "I acknowledge before God and in this legal document that Samuel, born approximately 1806, purchased by my late husband in 1819, has been my partner in all business matters since 1837. That he possesses intelligence, judgment, and capability equal to or exceeding any man of my acquaintance regardless of race. That the relationship between us has been based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and affection that I was forbidden by law and custom to acknowledge publicly. That he deserves to inherit what we built together, and that my daughters, who have contributed nothing to the estate's growth and who possess the advantages of education, social position, and white skin that will protect them regardless of their financial circumstances, have no moral claim to property they neither earned nor helped create." Mercer's hand shook as he wrote those words. "This admission will be used against you. Against the will's validity. Let it be used. I want the truth on record. I want someone, sometime, to read this and know that what existed between us was real. That it mattered. That I chose it freely despite everything it cost." When the will was complete, Lenora signed it with the same bold signature she used on business contracts. Samuel witnessed it, his mark rather than a signature because Lenora had been forbidden by law from teaching him to write. 2 other enslaved people from Blackwater, carefully chosen for their discretion, witnessed as well. Mercer left Blackwater that night with a document he knew would detonate like a bomb when it was finally opened. He filed it with his other papers and prayed Lenora would change her mind before death made the decision irreversible. She didn't change her mind. Over the next 3 weeks, as her illness progressed rapidly, she made additional arrangements. She met with each daughter separately, telling them she'd updated her will but providing no details. She wrote letters to business associates, ensuring they knew Samuel had authority to act in plantation matters. She organized her papers with the thoroughness of someone who knew others would be scrutinizing every decision she'd made. And she spent her final days with Samuel, in a way that made the household staff deeply uncomfortable, but that no one dared question while Lenora still breathed. Margaret would later testify that during her mother's final week, Samuel was in Lenora's room constantly, bringing her water, reading to her, sitting beside her bed in silence. Margaret had entered once without knocking and found them holding hands, Samuel's dark skin against Lenora's pale, dying flesh. The image would haunt her. Lenora Beaumont died on April 27, 1851, at 3 a.m. Samuel was with her at the end. According to the household servant who'd been waiting outside the room, she heard Lenora say, "You were the only true thing. Everything else was performance." Samuel emerged from that room a different man from the one who'd entered. The confidence, the authority he carried when Lenora was alive drained away. He became what the law said he was, property, waiting to see what the white family would decide to do with him. Lenora's daughters buried their mother with appropriate ceremony in the Natchez Cemetery. They wore black. They received condolences. They played their roles as grieving daughters perfectly. They had no idea that their mother's final act would strip away everything they'd assumed was theirs. The will reading was scheduled for May 2nd, 5 days after Lenora's death, in Jonathan Mercer's office in Natchez. Margaret, Caroline, and Virginia arrived together, dressed in mourning, expecting to hear the details of how their mother's fortune would be divided between them. They'd discussed it quietly among themselves. Margaret assumed she'd get the plantation since she understood its operations. Caroline expected the Natchez properties. Virginia hoped for enough money to finally marry on her own terms without needing their mother's approval. Mercer looked like a man facing execution as the three women settled into chairs across from his desk. He'd tried one last time to convince Lenora's daughters to accept a private settlement before the will was read, but they'd refused, confident that whatever their eccentric mother had arranged would ultimately benefit them. "Before I begin," Mercer said carefully, "I want you to understand that I advised your mother against certain provisions in this document. That I attempted to dissuade her multiple times. That what you're about to hear was her explicit decision against all counsel." Margaret frowned. "Jonathan, just read the will. We understand Mother was particular in her wishes." Mercer opened the document and began to read. He got through the standard legal language quickly. Then he reached the substantive provisions, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he read the words that granted Samuel his freedom and the entirety of the Beaumont estate. The reaction was not immediate. For several long seconds, the three women sat in frozen silence, their minds refusing to process what they'd just heard. Caroline's face went white. Virginia began to cry, soft, helpless sounds of confusion. Margaret stood up slowly, carefully, like someone testing whether the ground beneath her would hold. "That's impossible," Margaret said flatly. "You misread something. Mother would never." "I read it correctly. Your mother left the bulk of her estate to Samuel, with immediate manumission and full ownership transferred through a trust arrangement designed to survive legal challenge." "Samuel," Virginia whispered. "The field hand Samuel? Mother left our inheritance to a slave." "Not just any slave," Margaret said, and her voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "The one she kept at the house. The one she gave authority to. The one everyone whispered about but never said anything directly because it was too obscene to speak aloud." Caroline found her voice, and it shook with fury. How long was she conducting this relationship? Mercer hesitated, but the truth was in the will itself. "Your mother's statement suggests approximately 14 years. 14 years. Margaret repeated it like a curse. "Since I was 12 years old. Since father had been dead barely a year. She was carrying on with enslaved property while raising us, while maintaining her position in society, while presenting herself as a respectable widow. The will provides $5,000 to each of you," Mercer said, trying to find any silver lining. "That's $5,000. Caroline's voice rose to nearly a shout. "The estate is worth $500,000. We're entitled to that fortune. We're her daughters. We're white. We're legitimate. And she left everything to a man who's not even legally human." The racial language, spoken so boldly, hung in the air like smoke. Mercer had expected fury. He'd expected contestation. But the naked hatred in Caroline's voice startled even him. Margaret remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides, her breathing controlled with visible effort. "Where is he now? Where is Samuel?" "I don't know. Still at Blackwater, I assume." He knew about this. He had to know. Mother couldn't have written this will without his knowledge. He manipulated her. Used his position in the household to influence a sick woman. This is undue influence. Any court will see that. "Your mother was examined by Dr. Webb 2 weeks before her death. He certified her as being of sound mind. She knew exactly what she was doing." "Then she was insane in a way physicians can't measure," Margaret said coldly. "No sane woman would destroy her own daughters for a slave. We're contesting this immediately. We'll have it overturned. We'll have Samuel sold to pay the estate's debts. We'll have every provision invalidated." Mercer had expected this and had prepared his response. "Your mother anticipated contest. The will includes provisions designed to penalize anyone who challenges it. If you lose the legal battle, you forfeit even the $5,000 you were granted. We won't lose, Margaret said with absolute certainty. No Mississippi court will allow this travesty to stand. The law protects families. It protects white women and their children from exactly this kind of violation. By this time next month, that will be declared invalid, and Samuel will be back where he belongs. The three sisters left Mercer's office that afternoon and immediately began assembling the legal team that would fight the battle of their lives. The case of Beaumont Estate versus Samuel reached the Mississippi Chancery Court on May 20, 1851. Judge Alexander Morrison presiding. Morrison was 58 years old, a plantation owner himself, and a man whose entire worldview rested on the assumption that racial and gender hierarchies were divinely ordained and legally inviolable. The Beaumont daughters could not have asked for a more sympathetic judge. Their legal team was formidable. They'd hired Preston Whitmore, the most expensive attorney in Natchez, a man who'd built his reputation defending the property rights of white families against any threat. Whitmore understood immediately that this case was about more than one estate. It was about whether the entire social order could withstand women and enslaved people making claims that threatened white male authority. His strategy was elegant in its simplicity. He would argue 3 points. First, that Lenora had been mentally incompetent when she wrote the will, her judgment impaired by illness and laudanum. Second, that Samuel had exercised undue influence over a vulnerable dying woman. Third, that even if the will reflected Lenora's genuine wishes, Mississippi law simply did not permit such transfers to people of color, and the trust arrangement was a transparent attempt to circumvent restrictions designed to protect white society. Samuel, meanwhile, had almost no defense. Jonathan Mercer agreed to represent him, but Mercer was one attorney against a team of 3, and his heart wasn't fully in the fight. He'd advised against the will. He believed it was legally vulnerable. And he was deeply uncomfortable with the social implications of defending an enslaved man's right to inherit a fortune from a white woman. The preliminary hearing revealed just how weak Samuel's position was. Judge Morrison granted Whitmore's motion to freeze all estate assets pending resolution. He appointed a temporary administrator, a Natchez banker named Douglas Henley, to manage Blackwater and the other properties. And most devastatingly, he ruled that Samuel's manumission would be held in abeyance until the will's validity was determined, meaning Samuel remained legally enslaved, now to the estate itself rather than to Lenora personally. The cruelty of that decision cannot be overstated. Lenora's will had granted Samuel freedom and fortune. The court's ruling stripped both away and left him in limbo, neither slave to a living master who might show mercy, nor free man with rights to defend himself. Douglas Henley took control of Blackwater with the efficiency of someone managing property rather than human lives. He removed Samuel from any position of authority and sent him back to field labor. Samuel, 45 years old and unaccustomed to the brutal physical work after years of management duties, suffered through spring planting alongside men half his age. The overseers, resentful of the authority he'd once held over them, drove him harder than the others. It was punishment and humiliation designed to remind him of his place. Margaret, Caroline, and Virginia moved back into the Natchez townhouse, now managed by the estate administrator, but still technically theirs to occupy. They became celebrities of a sort in Natchez society. White families rallied around them, outraged on their behalf. How could a mother betray her own daughters? How could she prefer enslaved property to her own blood? The Beaumont sisters became symbols of white womanhood threatened by the very people they owned. But beneath the public support, uglier whispers circulated. Whispers about what kind of relationship could inspire such a will. Whispers about what Lenora Beaumont must have been doing with Samuel all those years. Whispers that turned the sisters' grief into humiliation, their mother's death into scandal. The trial itself began in July 1851. Natchez sweltered under Mississippi summer heat, and the courtroom was packed daily with spectators eager to watch the battle unfold. Samuel was required to attend, but was not permitted to sit at the defense table. He stood at the back of the courtroom, manacled despite being charged with no crime, a reminder to everyone present of what he was regardless of what Lenora's will claimed he should be. Whitmore's case began with medical testimony. Dr. Harrison Webb, the physician who'd examined Lenora, was called to testify about her final illness. Whitmore led him carefully through questions designed to suggest mental impairment. Dr. Webb, you examined Mrs. Beaumont in February of 1851, correct? I did. What was your diagnosis? Ovarian tumor, advanced and inoperable. Would such a condition cause pain? Severe pain, especially in the latest stages. And how did you recommend Mrs. Beaumont manage that pain? I prescribed laudanum, to be taken as needed. Laudanum being an opiate derivative that can affect judgment and perception. It can, yes, particularly in high doses. Did you observe any changes in Mrs. Beaumont's mental state during her final months? Webb hesitated, and that hesitation was damaging. She was focused on settling her affairs. That's common in terminal patients. Did she seem agitated? Obsessed with unusual ideas, contrary to her normal patterns of thought? She seemed determined to make certain arrangements, yes. Arrangements that struck you as unusual for a woman of her standing. Mercer objected, but Judge Morrison allowed the question. Webb's answer was carefully worded but devastating. I was surprised when I learned of the will's provisions. It didn't reflect the Lenora Beaumont I'd known for 16 years. The testimony established exactly what Whitmore needed. Doubt about Lenora's mental state, suggestion that pain and medication had clouded her judgment, the implication that the will reflected illness rather than genuine intention. Then Whitmore called character witnesses. Nat Shea Society ladies who'd known Lenora for decades testified about her propriety, her devotion to her daughters, her careful management of reputation. Each one expressed shock that such a woman could have written such a will. Each one suggested, delicately but clearly, that only madness could explain it. Next came the household staff from Blackwater. This testimony was the most damaging and the most revealing. Servants who'd lived in Lenora's house, who'd seen the daily operations of the plantation, were called to describe Samuel's unusual position and his relationship with their mistress. Martha Hayes, who'd worked as a house servant for 12 years, testified that Samuel had access to Lenora's private study, something no other enslaved person at Blackwater possessed. That he dined alone with Lenora after the daughters had gone to bed. That she'd heard them talking late into the night, their voices carrying through the old house, discussing not just plantation business but books, politics, ideas. Did this strike you as unusual? Whitmore asked. Yes, sir. Very unusual. Did you ever see physical contact between Mrs. Beaumont and Samuel? Martha hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I saw them standing close sometimes, closer than would be normal for mistress and slave. Did you see them touch? I saw her hand on his arm once. I saw him help her up from a chair, but his hand stayed on her shoulders longer than necessary. Little things that added up. What did you think was happening? Mercer objected that the witness couldn't testify to her thoughts, but Morrison allowed it. Martha looked at the floor. I tried not to think about it, sir. It wasn't my place to think about what the mistress did. The testimony created a picture of impropriety, of boundaries crossed, of a relationship that violated every rule governing how white women and enslaved men should interact. But it also created something else, something Whitmore hadn't intended, a portrait of two people who'd found something together that defied the categories available to describe it. When it was Mercer's turn to present Samuel's defense, he called only two witnesses. The first was Thomas Crawford, a Nat Shea banker who'd worked with Lenora on her business investments. Crawford testified that Lenora was the shrewdest investor he'd ever worked with, that her financial decisions were consistently sound, and that she'd shown no signs of diminished capacity even in her final months. Did she ever discuss Samuel with you? Mercer asked. She did. She said he had a gift for understanding markets, for seeing patterns in cotton prices and riverboat schedules. She said he'd suggested several investments that proved highly profitable. An enslaved field hand suggested financial investments. I was skeptical too, but Mrs. Beaumont insisted. And she was right every time. The testimony suggested Samuel was more than simple labor, but it also reinforced the transgressive nature of the relationship. White men in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. The idea that an enslaved man could understand markets, could advise a white woman on financial matters, threatened assumptions about racial capability that the entire slave system required. Mercer's second witness was Samuel himself. This was controversial. Enslaved people rarely testified in court, and when they did, their testimony carried no legal weight against white witnesses. But Mercer gambled that allowing Samuel to speak might humanize him, might help the judge see him as something other than property. Samuel was brought to the witness stand, still wearing manacles. He stood rather than sat, because sitting would have suggested a quality he wasn't permitted. Mercer's questions were carefully designed to establish Samuel's intelligence and his relationship with Lenora, without confirming the sexual impropriety that everyone suspected. Samuel, how long did you know Mrs. Beaumont? 32 years, sir. Since Mr. Charles bought me in 1819. What work did you do at Blackwater? Field work initially. Tobacco, then cotton. After Mr. Charles died, Mrs. Lenora moved me to other duties. Managing repairs, supervising planting schedules, handling livestock. Why do you think she gave you those responsibilities? She said I had a mind for organization, that I could see how different tasks connected. She started asking my opinion on things, and I gave it honestly. Did your relationship with Mrs. Beaumont change over time? Samuel was quiet for a long moment. The courtroom held its breath. Yes, sir. She treated me different than other masters treat their slaves. She listened when I spoke. She asked what I thought, not just what I'd done. She taught me things, though teaching slaves to read is illegal, so I can't testify to that directly. But I learned. And we talked about more than just plantation business. What did you talk about? Everything. Books she'd read. Politics in Washington. Whether cotton prices would hold. What it meant to build something that would last. She had ideas about the world, and she wanted to discuss them with someone who'd think seriously about what she said. I was that person. Did you love her? The question hung in the courtroom like summer heat. Whitmore started to object, then stopped, realizing the answer would damn Samuel regardless. Samuel looked directly at the three Beaumont sisters sitting in the front row. His voice was steady when he spoke. I don't know if a slave can love his master or if that's just survival wearing love's disguise. But I know that Lenora Beaumont saw me as a man when the law said I was property. She asked my opinion when society said I had no thoughts worth hearing. She built something with me when the world said I could only serve. If that was love, then yes. I loved her. And I believe she loved me, though loving me cost her everything, including her daughter's respect and her reputation after death. The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like gunfire, demanding order. Margaret Beaumont stood up, her face white with fury, and had to be restrained by Caroline from approaching the witness stand. Virginia sobbed openly, her hands covering her face. When order was finally restored, Whitmore began his cross-examination. He didn't ask about love or relationship. He asked about property and influence. Samuel, you're aware that Mrs. Beaumont's will makes you extraordinarily wealthy. I'm aware of what the will says, yes, sir. Did you ask her to write such a will? No, sir. Did you suggest it might be appropriate? No, sir. She told me what she'd done after it was already written. But you knew she was ill. You knew she was dying. You had access to her during her most vulnerable time. You were alone with her frequently. I was with her because she asked me to be. Because she was dying and she wanted someone who knew her truly with her at the end. Someone who knew her truly. Not her daughters, who she'd raised for decades. Not her friends from Natchez society. But you, her slave, who stood to gain everything if she died believing you cared for her. Samuel's voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. I gained nothing from her death, sir. I lost the only person who ever saw me as human. The will tried to give me freedom, but this court took it away. It tried to give me property, but white law won't allow it. All I actually have from Lenora's death is the memory of someone who was willing to tell the truth even when it destroyed her, and the knowledge that I'll probably be sold south when this trial ends to punish me for the crime of being loved by a white woman. The stark honesty of the statement silenced even Whitmore. Judge Morrison called a recess, and Samuel was led from the courtroom back to the holding cell, where he spent nights between trial sessions. The trial continued for 3 more weeks. Whitmore called the Beaumont daughters themselves to testify about their mother's behavior in her final months, about Samuel's inappropriate influence, about how their family had been destroyed by this transgressive relationship. Margaret testified with cold fury, Caroline with barely suppressed rage, Virginia with tears that seemed genuine but might have been performance. Each of them painted their mother as a victim, sick, vulnerable, manipulated by a clever slave who'd seen opportunity in a dying woman's loneliness. They couldn't admit the possibility that their mother had chosen this freely, that she'd preferred Samuel to them, that the relationship had been real rather than manipulation. Admitting that would mean confronting questions about their own family, their own mother, their own assumptions about the world they lived in. The testimony that ultimately decided the case came from an unexpected source. Dr. Webb was recalled to the stand, and Whitmore asked him a question that seemed routine but proved devastating. Dr. Webb, in your examination of Mrs. Beaumont, did you observe any physical signs that might suggest the nature of her relationship with Samuel? Mercer objected strenuously, but Morrison allowed it. Webb looked deeply uncomfortable. I observed scarring on Mrs. Beaumont's back. Old scars, long-healed. When I asked about them, she said they were from a fall from a horse in her youth. Did you believe that explanation? At the time, yes. But the pattern of scarring was unusual for such an injury. What pattern? Parallel lines. Consistent with marks from a whip or similar instrument. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Whitmore let the implication hang in the air before asking the next question. Is it possible Mrs. Beaumont acquired those scars not from a fall, but from abuse at the hands of someone with physical power over her? The suggestion was clear and horrifying. Whitmore was implying that Samuel had beaten Lenora, that their relationship was based on violence and fear, that the will was written under threat of physical harm. Mercer stood to object, but before he could speak, something unexpected happened. A woman in the gallery stood up and spoke out of turn, violating every rule of courtroom decorum. That's a lie, and you know it. Judge Morrison's gavel came down. Order. Sit down or be removed. But the woman didn't sit. She was elderly, perhaps 70, dressed in plain black, clearly not part of Natchez society. My name is Esther Crane. I was Lenora Ashford's nurse when she was a girl. I know where those scars came from, and it wasn't from any horsefall. Morrison looked ready to have her removed, but something in her voice made him hesitate. Whitmore, sensing danger, tried to have her barred from speaking, but Mercer immediately asked that she be allowed to testify as a witness. Morrison, perhaps curious himself, allowed it. Esther Crane took the stand with the deliberate movements of someone whose bones ached but whose mind remained sharp. Mercer asked her to explain what she'd meant. Lenora Ashford's father was a violent man, Esther said flatly. He believed in strict discipline for children, especially daughters who showed spirit. Lenora had spirit. She questioned things. She read books her father thought inappropriate. She expressed opinions. And her father beat that spirit out of her, or tried to. Those scars on her back came from her own father's whip when she was 14 years old. She nearly died from infection. I nursed her through it. And I watched a bright, questioning girl learn to hide who she was, to perform obedience, to never show her true thoughts to any man who had power over her. The courtroom had gone deathly quiet. Esther continued, her voice gaining strength. When Lenora married Charles Beaumont, she thought she was escaping. But Charles was cut from the same cloth as her father. Not as violent, but just as controlling. He made every decision. He controlled every aspect of her life. And Lenora learned to survive by being what he wanted, just as she'd survived her father. After Charles died, she was free for the first time in her life. Free to make her own choices. Free to be who she actually was rather than who men demanded she be. And part of who she was, apparently, was a woman who could love a man the world said she shouldn't, who could see value where society said none existed. Whitmore tried to object that this was speculation, not testimony, but Esther talked over him. I didn't know about Samuel until after Lenora died. But when I heard about the will, I understood. Lenora spent her whole life under the control of white men who owned her as surely as the law said she owned her slaves. Maybe Samuel was the first person who never tried to control her. Maybe that's worth more than all the propriety in Mississippi. Morrison had Esther removed from the courtroom, and her testimony was stricken from the record as improper. But the damage was done. Everyone present had heard it. Everyone understood the implications. The case wasn't just about property and racial hierarchy. It was about power, control, and a woman who'd finally chosen for herself. The trial concluded in early August. Judge Morrison took 2 weeks to prepare his ruling. When the court reconvened on August 18, 1851, every seat was filled. Morrison read his decision for 40 minutes, laying out legal precedents and Mississippi statutes. But the conclusion was predetermined from the start. He ruled that Lenora Beaumont's will was invalid on multiple grounds: undue influence by Samuel, mental incapacity due to illness and medication, and violation of Mississippi public policy regarding property transfers to enslaved people. The estate would pass to Lenora's daughters in equal shares. Samuel would be sold at public auction along with the other Blackwater enslaved people to settle court costs and administrative fees. The trust arrangement would be dissolved. Everything Lenora had tried to do was undone with the stroke of a judicial pen. Samuel stood in the back of the courtroom as the verdict was read, his face revealing nothing. He'd known this was coming. They all had. Mississippi law was never going to allow an enslaved man to inherit a white woman's fortune. The trial had been theater, the outcome inevitable. But what happened next surprised everyone. The auction was scheduled for August 25, 1851, 1 week after Judge Morrison's ruling. By law, enslaved people from dissolved estates had to be sold publicly to satisfy debts and distribute assets to heirs. Samuel, along with 43 other people from Blackwater Plantation, would be sold on the Natchez auction block to the highest bidder. The Beaumont sisters attended the auction, not out of sentiment, but out of business necessity. They needed to see what price their mother's enslaved property would bring, needed to calculate the estate's final value, needed to close this ugly chapter and move forward with their lives. Margaret stood in the front row of the crowd, her face expressionless behind a black veil. Caroline and Virginia flanked her, all three in morning dress despite the summer heat. Around them, Natchez planters and slave traders assessed the merchandise with professional detachment, checking teeth, examining muscles, calculating value. Samuel was brought out last. At 4 to 5, he was old by the brutal standards of plantation labor, but his size and strength still commanded attention. The auctioneer described him as experienced in field management, capable of heavy work, literate enough to keep basic records, though that was technically illegal to mention. The bidding started at $500. Low for a man of Samuel's capabilities, but his age worked against him. A trader from Alabama bid $600. A plantation owner from Louisiana went to $700. The price climbed slowly. Then a voice from the back of the crowd called out a bid that silenced everyone, $5,000. Heads turned. A man pushed through the crowd, well-dressed, clearly educated, his skin marking him as what the law called free man of color. He was perhaps 35, with the bearing of someone accustomed to navigating white spaces despite the constant threat such navigation entailed. The auctioneer frowned. Name and credentials. So. Marcus Whitfield. I'm a property owner from New Orleans. I have cash payment ready. Free coloreds can't purchase slaves in Mississippi without special permission from the court, the auctioneer said, though his voice wavered. $5,000 was $5,000, and the estate would benefit from such a sale. I have permission. Marcus held up papers. Judge Morrison signed these yesterday. They authorized this specific purchase. The crowd erupted in angry muttering. White bidders felt cheated. How could a free black man be allowed to outbid them? What was Morrison thinking? But the papers were legitimate, properly executed, and the bid stood. Margaret Beaumont pushed forward. This is irregular. I want to see those papers. Marcus handed them over calmly. Margaret read through them, her expression darkening. The documents were legally perfect. Morrison had indeed granted special permission for this purchase. But why? Who are you? Margaret demanded. Why would you pay $5,000 for a field hand? Marcus met her eyes with carefully controlled defiance. Samuel is my uncle. My father's brother. My father purchased his own freedom 20 years ago in Virginia and moved to New Orleans. He spent 2 decades trying to locate Samuel, trying to save enough money to purchase him. He died last year, but he left me his savings and his mission. I'm here to finish what he started. I'm buying my uncle's freedom." The revelation rippled through the crowd. Samuel, standing on the auction block, showed emotion for the first time since Lenora's death. His eyes found Marcus, and something that looked like hope cracked through the careful blankness he'd maintained. Margaret should have challenged it, should have found some legal mechanism to block the sale. But something stopped her. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was a tiny remnant of conscience. Maybe it was the ghost of her mother's voice asking her whether she'd really become someone who would prevent a man from saving his own family. $5,000, she said quietly. Sold. The transaction was completed that afternoon. Marcus paid in cash, received the papers that made him Samuel's legal owner, and within an hour had filed manumission documents freeing Samuel under Louisiana law, which was marginally more permissive than Mississippi's restrictions. Samuel walked away from that courthouse a free man at age 45, having spent 32 years enslaved. Everything Lenora had tried to give him, he'd lost. But he had his freedom, and that was more than most enslaved people ever got. What happened next is documented in scattered records, letters, and later testimony. Marcus took Samuel to New Orleans, where free people of color had carved out a precarious community with limited but real rights. Samuel lived with Marcus and his family for several months, recovering from the physical and psychological damage of the trial and its aftermath. But Samuel didn't stay in New Orleans. In November 1851, he did something that shocked everyone who knew the story. He wrote to Margaret Beaumont. The letter, preserved in the Beaumont family papers, is the only surviving document in Samuel's own handwriting. His literacy, illegal when acquired, now served as proof of everything Lenora had claimed about his intelligence. The letter read, "Miss Margaret, I am writing because there are things you deserve to know, things your mother wanted me to tell you if she didn't survive to say them herself. She loved you, all 3 of you. But she also knew that the advantages of being white women in Mississippi would protect you in ways that freedom alone could never protect her children by me." Yes, her children. Daniel was born in 1838. Ruth in 1841. Both died in childhood, one of fever, one of accident. Both are buried in unmarked graves at Blackwater because acknowledging them would have endangered us all. Your mother bore 5 children in her life. You know about 3. The world never knew about the other 2. She grieved for Daniel and Ruth every day of her life. She carried that grief silently because speaking it would have revealed what the law said was impossible, that she loved children who were born enslaved because their father was property. When she wrote her will, she wasn't abandoning you. She was trying to ensure that I could free others at Blackwater, that the enslaved people she couldn't legally free in her lifetime might gain freedom through the estate she left me. She was trying to dismantle from beyond the grave what she'd spent her life maintaining. The will wasn't about enriching me. It was about liberation. I'm telling you this not to make you feel guilty, but because you deserve to know who your mother really was. Not the woman Natchez society created, not the invalid the court declared her to be, but the person she actually was, complex, contradictory, trying to find some way to live honestly in a world built on lies. I forgive you for fighting the will. You didn't know. How could you have known when your mother kept so much hidden even from you? But I want you to know that she loved you until her last breath, and that the choice she made wasn't about loving you less. It was about trying to love us all in a world that said such love was impossible. Samuel. Margaret never responded to the letter, but she kept it, filed it away in her personal papers where it remained for over a century, discovered only when the Beaumont family documents were donated to a historical society in the 1960s. The 3 Beaumont sisters divided their mother's estate in 1852. They sold Blackwater Plantation to a cotton trader from Memphis. They sold the business interests. They liquidated most of the investments. They split the proceeds and went their separate ways. Margaret never married. She used her inheritance to purchase a small farm in northern Mississippi where she lived alone, managing it herself with hired labor rather than enslaved workers, a choice that earned her reputation as an eccentric. She died in 1889, leaving her property to a freedmen's school. Caroline married in 1854, a Memphis merchant who'd made his fortune in textiles. She had 4 children and lived comfortably until her death in 1891. She never spoke of her mother or the scandal publicly. Virginia married in 1853, moved to Mobile, Alabama, and died in childbirth in 1856 at age 26. Her husband remarried within the year. Samuel lived in New Orleans until 1860. As tensions between North and South escalated, Louisiana became increasingly hostile to free people of color. New laws restricted their movement, their ability to work, their fundamental rights. When the Civil War began in 1861, Samuel was nearly 55 years old, too old for military service but young enough to understand what the war meant. He spent the war years working with Marcus in what would later be called the Underground Railroad, though that term oversimplifies the complex networks of escape and resistance. Samuel used his knowledge of plantation operations, his understanding of how enslaved people thought and moved, to help others escape what he'd survived. After the war, during Reconstruction, Samuel did something remarkable. He returned to Mississippi, not to Natchez, but to the interior where Margaret had purchased her farm. Why he sought her out after everything that had happened between their families, the historical record doesn't fully explain. But they had a relationship of some kind during the final years of her life. Not friendship exactly, but something more complicated. A mutual understanding that they'd both been damaged by the same system, both trapped in roles that destroyed any possibility of honest connection. When Margaret died in 1889, her will left her farm to the Freedmen's School, but included a provision granting Samuel lifetime residence in the farmhouse if he wished to remain there. He declined. At 83 years old, he moved back to New Orleans to live with Marcus's children, his grandnieces and grandnephews, who'd grown up hearing stories about the uncle who'd been enslaved by a white woman who loved him. Samuel died in 1893 at age 87. He was buried in Girard Street Cemetery in New Orleans in a plot purchased by his family. His gravestone, unlike Celia's in the Fairmont story, bore no mention of freedom or status. It simply read, Samuel Whitfield, 1806 to 1893. He survived. The Beaumont case faded from public memory much faster than the Fairmont case had. There were no appeals, no extended legal battles after Morrison's initial ruling. The story was too ugly, the questions it raised too uncomfortable. Natchez society preferred to forget that one of their own had written such a will, that a white widow had loved an enslaved man, that children had been born and died in bondage to their own father. But the case documents survived. Deposited in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, accessible to anyone curious enough to look. And in those documents is the evidence of what actually existed at Blackwater Plantation during those years. There are Lenora's financial records, showing Samuel's involvement in every major business decision from 1837 forward. There are household accounts in 2 different handwritings, one clearly Lenora's, one belonging to someone else who was literate despite such literacy being illegal. There are letters Lenora wrote to business associates mentioning my manager without ever specifying that manager's race or status. There are architectural drawings for modifications to the main house showing a room added in 1840 with specifications that suggest private quarters rather than servant space. Most tellingly, there are birth and death records for Blackwater Plantation. Standard practice required plantation owners to record all births and deaths among their enslaved population for insurance and inventory purposes. In Lenora's ledgers, entries appear for infant boy, property of estate in June 1838, and female child, property of estate in March 1841. Both entries note deaths within the first year of life. Neither child is named in the official records, because enslaved infants often weren't named until they survived longer. But in Lenora's private correspondence, discovered in a locked box in the Natchez house after Margaret's death, there are 2 letters she never sent. One written in 1838, one in 1841. Both addressed simply to my child. Both describing grief that she couldn't express publicly. Both acknowledging motherhood that the law refused to recognize. The 1838 letter reads in part, You lived only 6 days. 6 days in which I held you, nursed you, loved you with an intensity that terrified me because I knew the law said you were property, not my son. Samuel carved your name on a piece of wood and buried it with you in the corner of the far field where the magnolias grow. Daniel. We named you Daniel, though no record will ever show it. I am a mother grieving her child, and the world will never acknowledge my grief because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that we are all human regardless of what the law claims. The existence of these children, born to Lenora and Samuel, changes the entire context of the will. It wasn't just about a romantic relationship, though it was that too. It was about a mother trying to protect the only children she had left with the man she loved, trying to ensure that what she'd built wouldn't be used to perpetuate the system that had killed two of her children and would have enslaved them had they lived. The will failed in its immediate purpose. Samuel didn't inherit the estate. The enslaved people at Blackwater weren't freed by its provisions. The money didn't go toward liberation. But in a broader sense, perhaps Lenora achieved something anyway. She told the truth. She forced Natchez to confront, even briefly, the reality of what happened in those plantation houses. She refused to die quietly maintaining the fictions that made slavery possible. And decades later, when historians began excavating the uncomfortable truths of the antebellum South, the Beaumont case provided evidence. Proof that the relationships everyone knew existed but refused to acknowledge were real. That enslaved people were capable of everything white society claimed they weren't. That white women weren't the passive, pure figures that Southern mythology required them to be. That the entire system was built on lies about human nature, racial capability, and what was possible between people if the Lord didn't forbid it. There's a final document in the Beaumont papers that crystallizes everything. It's a note found in Lenora's study after her death, written in her hand on the day she signed the will. It wasn't part of the official document. It was never read in court. It simply said, "They will call this madness. They will say I was incompetent, manipulated, corrupted. Let them. I know what I built with Samuel was real. I know that our children, brief as their lives were born from love rather than violence, from choice rather than ownership. I know that the law is wrong about who deserves freedom and who deserves property. If this will fails, at least it will have been written. At least someone, sometime, will read it and know that one white woman in Mississippi saw her enslaved partner as a human being and tried to give him what she could never give openly, equality, recognition, and freedom. That's not madness. That's the sanest thing I've ever done." The questions Lenora's will raised never received complete answers. Could love exist between master and enslaved? Or was every relationship across that power divide inherently coerced regardless of what participants felt? Could a white woman in the antebellum South make a truly free choice about such a relationship? Or was she herself so constrained by patriarchy that her choices were always limited? Could Samuel have said no to Lenora without risking his life? And if he couldn't refuse, can what existed between them really be called love? These questions are uncomfortable because they resist easy answers. The historical record suggests genuine affection, mutual respect, and partnership between Lenora and Samuel. But it also shows the fundamental impossibility of equality between owner and owned. Both things can be true simultaneously. Love can exist in the context of oppression without negating the oppression. Individuals can transcend social categories without changing the categories themselves. What we know with certainty is that Lenora Beaumont tried to use her wealth and legal power to challenge the system she'd been born into. That Samuel survived 3 decades of enslavement, lost the woman he loved and the freedom she tried to give him, and still lived long enough to see that system destroyed by civil war. That 2 children were born into impossible circumstances and died without the world ever acknowledging their existence. And that 3 white daughters inherited wealth built partially on the labor of their half-siblings, a truth they never fully confronted. The Beaumont Plantation house doesn't stand anymore. It burned in 1875, origin of the fire never determined. The land was subdivided and sold. Nothing marks the location of the Magnolia Corner where 2 children are buried without headstones. The Natchez townhouse still exists, converted now to law offices, its history sanitized for tourism purposes. But in the archives, the documents wait. 800 pages of testimony, letters, financial records, and legal arguments. They tell a story that history tried to forget about power and love, about survival and resistance, about a will that failed in court but succeeded in forcing truth into the light. If you found this story compelling, if it challenged your assumptions about the antebellum South, then you understand why we do what we do here at the Sealed Room. These stories, the ones that got buried because they were too complex, Too uncomfortable, too threatening to simple narratives about heroes and villains. These are the ones that matter most. They show us that history was never as clean as we want it to be, that people in impossible situations made impossible choices, and that understanding the past requires sitting with contradictions that don't resolve neatly. What do you think? Was Lenora Beaumont a hero trying to dismantle slavery from within, or a hypocrite who maintained the system until her death? Was Samuel a victim of that system, a beneficiary of proximity to power, or something more complicated than either label allows? Could what existed between them be called love, or does the context of enslavement make that word impossible to apply? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear how you wrestle with these questions. And if you want more stories like this, stories that expose the buried truths of American history, subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're committed to bringing you the cases that textbooks skip, the scandals that challenge social orders, and the people who refuse to accept the roles their world assigned them. The past is never simple, and the most important stories are the ones we almost lost. The truth, as Lenora Beaumont understood in her final days, is worth telling even when it destroys everything. Especially then. Because only by confronting what we were can we understand what we became, and only by excavating these buried stories can we see the full complexity of the American experience. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Let's keep these histories alive, uncomfortable as they are, because forgetting them means repeating the lies they expose.